Hello there, and welcome to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Ben, and I've been wasting my life for the past decade developing a science of philosophy called Paraphilosophy. If you'd like to first hear a basic introduction to what exactly paraphilosophy is and what it aims to show, you may wish to watch one of the videos shown on the screen now before this one, though I'll do my best to make this video accessible to you if you would prefer to jump in at the deep end. This presentation has been in the making for the better part of a year and has become quite extensive. I could have made it into a book, but instead I offer it to you for free here on this channel. I think it is important that I illuminate the path as best I can for those who wish to understand paraphilosophy, and later on to highlight the connections between paraphilosophy and certain traditions from both the East and West, which many of you have already associated it with. And perhaps the main reason you clicked on this video, I want to show how paraphilosophy deals with the ultimate question. This is a series for everyone who has decided to spend a significant portion of their time researching and reading philosophical material. If you're anything like I was, we simply need to find that point at which uncertainty ends, to find a solid and reliable foundation for our choices and outlook on life. We need this before we can allow ourselves to truly live. And of course, this need is fueled by the belief, or the intuition, or the hope that there really is some ultimate understanding out there waiting to be found. And so the main question we shall be tackling is, what is the ultimate truth of life, the universe, and everything else? Before we get started, I do need to say that I've been posting videos on this channel for over 3 years now, and it's reached that point where the line between a hobby and a job has become very much blurred. Basically, I need money. Trust me, it pains me, but I must ask that if you find or have found my content valuable, and if you want to help me continue producing and releasing similar content for free, that you consider becoming a patron of this channel. You can find all the details down in the description. Thank you so very much if you do decide to pitch in.
So, to jump right into it, in paraphilosophy, what we have shown is that all philosophical theories can be represented by a simple quadrant diagram, which we call the dialectical matrix. This structure mirrors the structure of our experience of the world. It mirrors the structure of our psychological capacity to reason about the world, and it mirrors the structure of our ability to evaluate claims as true or false. And so, in regard to paraphilosophy, it is quite natural that we should question whether the dialectical matrix, the structure of rational thought, corresponds to the actual structure of reality, independent of human experience, or whether it merely represents the structure of human reason and experience, which is translating some transcendent or noumenal reality into certain categories of understanding, experience, and thought. In other words, does our experience reveal reality, or does it conceal reality? You might note here that this problem is reminiscent of the one which separated Georg Hegel and Immanuel Kant many years ago. The dialectical matrix is somewhat like Kant's categories of understanding, which structure experience, and while Kant believed that this structure imposes a limit on what we can grasp about reality, Hegel would argue that the structure is precisely that which enables us to grasp reality, since it reflects the correspondence between subjectivity and objectivity. Now, to arrive at the dialectical matrix, we need to study the relations between different beliefs, theories, and psychological functions, to identify properties that ideas from different areas of discourse have in common. The dialectical matrix itself is not claiming anything, it's just showing what can be claimed. Paraphilosophy is established via the self-justification of the dialectical matrix. It is the self-recognition of the dialectical matrix, which occurs through human experience, that allows us to assert that the matrix is describing reality. So, in paraphilosophy, the subjective attempt to explain reality is complementary and ultimately non-dual with the objective appearance of reality. That is, our evolving understanding of reality is intrinsically linked to how reality unfolds before us. This aligns with Hegel's assertion that the rational is actual and the actual is rational. Indeed, we might consider that the dialectical matrix functions similarly to Hegel's concept of spirit, which is the organizing principle of reality in the ongoing realization of the absolute concept, which is, of course, paraphilosophy. So, if we take for granted that we accept paraphilosophy, and you can refer to my other videos to see why we should accept paraphilosophy, then we cannot make the claim that the dialectical matrix is not objective, at least in a conventional and relative sense. The harmony of the subjectivity and the objectivity of the matrix is essential to paraphilosophy, and without this unity, paraphilosophy cannot in fact be established. But what does this mean for our natural desire to understand what is ultimately real? Suppose we really want to find some specific theory that explains how things are beyond all relativity. Well, we must first recognize that any attempt to describe reality will fit within the dialectical matrix as a consequence of the fact that we must use dualistic concepts to make our descriptions intelligible. But paraphilosophy also tells us that each aspect of the dialectical matrix expresses a relative truth, not an absolute truth, and this might at first seem disheartening to people who are first learning about paraphilosophy, as it seems to imply that we cannot know what is ultimately true. You'll have to take my word that any displeasure or skepticism you feel in regard to this implication will pass when you understand better what is actually going on. Now, subjectivism and objectivism reflect the typical duality between the mental and the material. And since these perspectives are biased in opposite directions, they're not really very good candidates for an ultimate truth. Well, they clearly are for some people, and so it's certainly worth exploring that further, but I'll take for granted in this video that we have set aside this bias. I think a lot of people who are interested in these ideas have already recognized that the major problem in contemporary science and philosophy is that we assume experience to be constituted by subjects, minds filled with ideas, encountering objects, an independently existing realm of things. But it is possible to think about the world in a less dogmatic or one-sided manner, as consciousness encountering phenomena, where phenomena are simply appearances or representations that are interdependent with consciousness itself. This would be more of a phenomenological approach, where instead of a subject encountering an object, experience is the interplay of the superjective and the abjective. Subjectivism and objectivism are biased towards subjectivity or objectivity respectively, while abjectivism and superjectivism are not. They are neutral. Abjectivism says that reality is found neither inside nor outside consciousness, resulting in neutral monism or pluralism, while superjectivism says that reality is found in their unity, resulting in absolute idealism. I think for many people who reject dualism or materialism, one of these neutral perspectives is the most natural place to land. We should first consider, therefore, whether abjectivism or superjectivism might capture the ultimate truth. But before we endeavour to answer this question, there's one important thing we need to keep in mind, and that is that the quadrants of the dialectical matrix encapsulate all possible varieties or interpretations of themselves. So, for example, ontological objectivism encapsulates all possible forms of materialism, like eliminativism and reductionism and emergentism. Accordingly, we can analyse each quadrant philosophically and monotheistically as a search for an absolute truth, or we can approach them paraphilosophically and integrally as an attempt to understand the structural harmony and correspondence between each of the four classes of perspective. The difference is crucial because a philosophical interpretation of a quadrant is absolutely true just in case all other theories are false. But a paraphilosophical interpretation of a quadrant is valid relative to corresponding interpretations in the other quadrants. So, if we were to say that only one of the quadrants is absolutely true and that the others are false, then we don't need to worry about the implications that a certain way of interpreting one quadrant has for corresponding interpretations of the other quadrants. But since, in paraphilosophy, we recognize the relative truth of all the quadrants, our ability to rationally interpret a quadrant will be limited by the intelligibility of corresponding interpretations of the other quadrants, which are equally valid. To put this more simply, each quadrant can be interpreted exclusively or inclusively. Exclusive interpretations will be philosophical perspectives, and inclusive interpretations will be paraphilosophical. An exclusive perspective takes the validity and rationality of that quadrant to be independent of the other quadrants, while an inclusive perspective takes the validity of that quadrant to be interdependent with the validity of other quadrants. This is how paraphilosophy gets its explanatory power, because it means that not just anything can be true to an equal degree. The truth of any perspective is dependent on the intelligibility of the perspectives of other quadrants that it correlates with. What we shall find in paraphilosophy is that there is a spectrum of harmonization across all four quadrants, with the point of maximum harmony representing the maximal validity of those perspectives, and with less harmonious perspectives being less valid. Paraphilosophy is therefore not a form of trivialism, because the relativity of truth is itself relative, and it's relative to the impartiality and comprehensiveness of our understanding, which we call Syntheoretic Harmony, the structural alignment between different ways it can be explained. This is a difficult point to get your head around at first, not because it is complicated, but because it's just a very different way of thinking about philosophy and the search for truth. In paraphilosophy, we are not just describing everything that could possibly be true, we are describing the structure of our ability to understand. For our ability to understand is structured by logical rules that ensure balance and harmony amongst all the different ways we could understand something. So what I mean by harmony here is simply that condition by which a particular way of understanding something, such as, for instance, a mechanistic explanation for causation, does not preclude a different way of understanding that thing, such as a finalistic explanation for causation. And what exactly can preclude or contradict a contrary explanation? It is the structure and implications of any explanation. So, if our mechanistic interpretation has a certain practical consequence, that consequence must also be a consequence of the finalistic interpretation. If it were not, the two perspectives would be lopsided and would be predicting different things. They would not be aspects of one whole, but competing theories with different implications. In this way, there can be no way of impartially discriminating between corresponding paraphilosophical perspectives, because they're simply describing the same implications from a different set of premises. There is therefore an equally reasonable counterpoint for every point of every perspective in paraphilosophy. Harmonious or syntheoretic perspectives may contradict each other in their contents. One might posit a world of physical things, while another might posit a world of ideas, but the structural implications and predictions of each will be reflected by each other through complementarity, such that both perspectives are equally intelligible and equally explanatorily powerful. Alright, with that said, let's return our attention to our two neutral perspectives. We'll start with Superjectivism. So, the superjective, as the concrete universal totality of experience, embodies a synthesis of individuality and universality, where individual ego consciousnesses are interwoven into a kind of collective consciousness, and thus contribute to a shared reality. Hegel's notion of absolute spirit therefore aligns with the superjective, as it posits that the universal, which for Hegel is absolute, is realized through the concrete manifestations of itself. That is, true universality emerges from the sharedness of individual difference. It is the sameness within difference, and so there is no ultimate reality, nor universal consciousness or spirit, in the absence of relativized or particularized expressions of itself. The superjective is not simply an abstract notion of consciousness that many individuals express, nor is it a transcendent absolute that is independent of relative experience. It is, rather, the common thread that binds all individuals together. If we were to assert that the superjective is a wholly independent and transcendent absolute consciousness, and that everything else is an illusory appearance within this consciousness, then we would not be in harmony with the other quadrants, because we would be denying the truth of the other quadrants. This would therefore be a philosophical perspective that excludes other perspectives. However, in paraphilosophy, the superjective also represents the self-referential aspect of the dialectical matrix, and therefore contains the other perspectives within it. This might at first make it seem as though the dialectical matrix itself, as a higher-order superject, is ultimate, while the individual perspectives are relative. But the superjective is still not a foundational ground in this sense, because the self-similarity of the dialectical matrix entails that itself has no ground. Self-reference goes on ad infinitum. The dialectical matrix, and this higher-level form of superjectivism, therefore acts as the structure through which the possible ways to conceive of reality relate to each other, but it's not a fundamental thing that exists independently of our actual conception of reality. It's a sort of correlation does not equal causation situation. There is a fundamental structure, but we cannot say that this structure produces reality in a transcendental sense. We can only say that it is the structure through which phenomenal reality is produced, or the structure of the possibility of the relative reality of each quadrant. There are therefore elements of both Kant and Hegel in this. As for Kant, the categories of understanding structure our experience of reality, but are not themselves nominally real. And for Hegel, spirit is the unfolding process through which reality rationally produces itself, but is not a pre-existing ultimate cause. The superjective is therefore also a bit like the logos of Heraclitus. It is the principle of order that is revealed in the correlation between the rationality of human thinking and the rationality of the structure of experience. Alright, now let us consider Abjectivism, and first let us be reminded of the distinction we drew earlier between an exclusive interpretation, which ignores the other quadrants, and an inclusive interpretation, which acknowledges the other quadrants. So, in ontology, the abjective relates to the concept of abstract particulars, which are individual instances of a property. The most obvious and inclusive way to interpret the abjective is therefore as a kind of phenomenalism, or representationalism, where abstract particulars are understood as individual instances of qualities, or tropes. These tropes can be interpreted as instances of abstract universals, from a subjectivist perspective, as the structure of concrete particulars, from an objectivist perspective, and as the appearances of consciousness from a superjectivist perspective. And this perspective actually has its roots in the ideas of the early empiricists, who became convinced that objects are nothing more than bundles of sensations, or properties, or relations, or events. For instance, George Berkeley and David Hume, and to a lesser extent, even John Locke. Immanuel Kant was deeply influenced by these thinkers, and his own version of phenomenalism, transcendental idealism built upon their ideas. Kant agreed that phenomena are appearances, but he did not reject the possibility of the object existing in some more fundamental way beyond sensation. We'll return to this in a moment. It's also interesting to note here that even many of the early positivists, who were highly sceptical of metaphysics, such as Ernst Mach and Bertrand Russell, arrived at ontological abjectivism, or neutral monism, positing that sensory phenomena are pure data. The logical positivists were drawn to phenomenalism because they recognized that the only things we can meaningfully talk about are actual or possible sensory experiences. However, the concept of possible experience still presupposes certain conditions that cannot themselves be derived from experience. Kant's solution for this is that preconditions for experience, like space, time, and causality, are necessary to make sense of sensory data, making them synthetic a priori laws of experience, which fits with the Abjectivist epistemology. So, if we are taking a strictly inclusive and syntheoretic approach, then both Abjectivism and Superjectivism are describing the same thing in two different ways. They are both describing the interdependence of phenomena. Superjectivism approaches this interdependence in a more positive and holistic way, while Abjectivism approaches it more negatively and fragmentally. That is, for Superjectivism, reality is the evolving expression of an impersonal consciousness, via its own instantiation as individual personal consciousnesses, where the interdependence of phenomena is ultimately collapsed into this universal consciousness. So there is a connection here between Superjectivism and the philosophy of Georg Hegel, as well as certain interpretations of the Vedanta philosophy, which we'll be discussing later on in this series. For Abjectivism, reality is a cognitively structured web of sensations, and we cannot see beyond these sensations to posit of any things in themselves. There is therefore a connection here between Abjectivism and the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, as well as certain interpretations of Buddhist philosophy, which we'll also be discussing later on in this series. And I should say that I do think that a philosophy of the interdependence of the abjective and the superjective is in many ways the ultimate philosophy. It is the most foundational way of explicating the nature of phenomenal reality. It's simply that this still operates in the realm of relativity and of perspectives. It is not the ultimate truth. But there is another interpretation of Abjectivism, and that is if we take abstract particulars as mathematical structures, which are neither mental nor material. Every instance of a property would then correspond to a mathematical object or relation. Of course, if we are taking mathematics to be the ultimate nature of the world, while sensory data is purely extrinsic, then we are interpreting Abjectivism in a more exclusive way, because mathematics would be fundamental, while phenomenal experience is epiphenomenal. That is, the mathematical structures would be independent of human reason and experience, in the sense that they are actually out there in themselves. We should also keep in mind that the quadrants of the dialectical matrix are first and foremost perspectives, aspects of our ability to rationalize our experience. It is only in establishing the relative truth of the quadrants that we are able to talk of them as different ontic domains, as extrapolations of perspectives. So, when we talk about different domains, such as the domain of abjective information or the domain of objective entities, we're talking about the different ways that a single reality can be represented. Just like how when we talk about different perspectives, we're talking about the different ways that something can be interpreted. As such, everything that can be said about one domain must correspond to something that can be said about the other domains. So, how can we explain this mathematical or informational interpretation of Abjectivism without making it into an exclusive, monolithic, philosophical theory of the fundamental nature of reality? The most obvious solution would be to say that the mathematical structure of possibility does not exist as a determinate, transcendent noumenon, but simply describes the limits of possible experience. In this way, we could interpret all of the four quadrants as complementary perspectives, because mathematics would be dependent on phenomenal experience rather than existing as an independent reality in a Platonic sense. Mathematical truths would emerge from the structuring activity of human reason, and mathematical objects would be real insofar as they could be generated within the constraints of possible experience. This interpretation would fit very well with the epistemology and logic of Abjectivism, because mathematics would be synthetic and not analytic. The underlying logic of mathematics would be intuitionistic and paracomplete, and the designated truth value of Abjectivism is neither true nor false, reflecting the idea that phenomenal reality is structured through cognition, rather than being fixed in an eternal, fully determinate realm. Of course, it would be absurd to claim that the possibility for experience exists only within phenomenality itself, because then it would have been impossible for phenomenality to arise in the first place. There must be a form of possibility, or rather potential, which precedes or complements phenomenality and cognition, since phenomenal reality does seem to exist from our perspective, and thus it is possible for it to seem to exist. This potential is not a mathematical probability, but rather the openness or freedom or limitlessness of the mere fact that there is something rather than nothing. This is indeed noumenal and non-rational, but it's also not a thing. It has no structure or order, because it's simply the absence of any things, structure, or order, which ensures that the emergence of things, structure, and order is not restricted or prevented. Provided we do not conflate the mere potential for anything at all, which is paraphilosophical, with the mathematical possibility or probability for something in particular, which is abjectivist, then there is no problem with this line of reasoning from a paraphilosophical perspective. The danger here, and this is always going to be the danger with teaching and learning about paraphilosophy, is that the mind has a natural tendency to want to try to rationalize that which is beyond reason. Given that phenomenality and rationality are reflections of each other, to try and escape phenomenality, which is to say, to try and step outside of phenomenality in order to explain from a transcendent perspective how phenomenality arises, is simply to reason yourself out of reason. Now, that's fine if you understand this. I do it all the time. Such explanations are good insofar as they are helpful, but it's a problem if you are not aware of the limits of what you are trying to do. The perspectives of the dialectical matrix are dynamic. They decohere and separate as consciousness becomes more capable of distinguishing self from other, subject from object. If you take this process back far enough, then you would have a state in which all of the quadrants of the dialectical matrix are totally unified. Indeed, each quadrant would effectively cancel out its opposite. You can watch a short video on my channel to get a good idea of what I mean here. This state must be non-rational because there would be absolutely no distinction between any of the opposites we use in philosophy to reason about the world. And so we can now make a first gesture towards what was always the only true candidate for an ultimate truth. This is, of course, the unstructured, indeterminate potentia mentioned earlier, which we cannot ultimately say anything rational about. But we can try, and I will try throughout this series. Paraphilosophy is a term that can be explained in a number of different ways. In a loose sense, we can use it to refer to the general subject of study I talk about on this channel and in my book, and to the recognition of the relative truth of different philosophical perspectives. But this isn't what paraphilosophy means in a more literal sense. Paraphilosophy is not a philosophy, nor is it really a conceptual thing at all, so nothing I say to try to express the reasonableness of paraphilosophy will be entirely paraphilosophical itself. Paraphilosophy is the basic condition of reality, and everything I say to point towards this condition and not to explain it. Most of what I say concerns the methodology of realizing paraphilosophy and the implications of having realized it for traditional philosophy. So, what I want to do now is provide one of the more direct ways that we can understand what this term, paraphilosophy, is actually pointing towards. One could say that the entire point of engaging with paraphilosophy is simply to understand what the term itself means, and mistaking it for merely a new subject of study is ultimately to miss the point. Paraphilosophy is simply what reality is, and so the term is, in this sense, an adjective, not a noun. Reality is, literally, beyond philosophy, paraphilosophy. No conceptual model can express what reality is in its entirety, and paraphilosophy is the most fitting adjective to describe reality if we are coming from the perspective of traditional philosophical thinking, which tries to explain reality. At the same time, reality is not entirely irrational, it is describable by philosophical theories, it is simply that there is no single philosophical theory which describes it completely. As such, the term paraphilosophy is trying to convey two quite different but intimately related things. On the one hand, it is expressing a kind of theoretic pluralism, wherein we recognise the usefulness and relative validity of conceptual models of the world. And on the other hand, it's expressing the ultimate insufficiency of any conceptual model, and the basic intellectual trap of believing that one's ability to reason about the world is somehow separated from how the world is represented to us. In order to properly articulate this, I'm going to be introducing some more neologisms that I actually never intended to introduce. You won't find them in my book, for instance. The reason I did not want to introduce these terms is because as soon as you name something, you get a concept of it, and if you have a concept of it, then you can mistake it for a real thing. I deliberately tried to avoid this in my choice to simply use the term paraphilosophy to refer to something that can be approached and interpreted in so many different ways. But as time has gone on, and as I've had discussions with many of you, I've found there to be instances where using these terms is very useful, so I'm going to try it out here with this disclaimer. So, to go through this all very simply, if we understand philosophy to be the implementation of conceptual thought in order to provide explanations for various aspects of our experience, then paraphilosophy is beyond this. Of course, philosophy is not just a process of forming beliefs and theories about reality, it's also a formalization of human reasoning in a more general sense. Paraphilosophy is philosophical in the sense that it is concerned with the capacity of humans to reason about their experiences, and all of my attempts to point towards paraphilosophy will also be philosophical for the same reason. But when I talk about something as being beyond philosophy, I'm referring to something that is beyond the formulation of philosophical theories which are supposed to reflect the actual state of things, the objective truth. This kind of activity is essential to philosophy as a discipline, and indeed the intention to work out the most reasonable explanations for things is the original drive behind the discipline we now refer to as philosophy. Even though in more modern times many philosophers do not actually spend their days trying to find the objective truth, particularly with the rise of things like postmodernism, deconstruction, pragmatism, hermeneutics, and so on. Indeed, I think many will find that these disciplines signal the development away from traditional philosophy and towards paraphilosophy. But when we refer to a philosophy, we're usually referring to a particular explanation for some facet of human experience. A philosophy is a particular perspective, and so paraphilosophy is that which is beyond particular perspectives. One of the ways in which I have explained paraphilosophy elsewhere is as the capacity of sentient beings to rationalize their experiences, whereas a philosophy is a particular instance of this capacity. This is why I refer to it as an inversion of the function of belief. Instead of starting with our reasoning capacity and using it to arrive at some particular belief or other, we instead start with all beliefs and return to our capacity to believe in them. In the former, we're trying to understand a particular perspective, while in the latter, we're trying to understand ourselves and our ability to hold perspectives in the first place. Paraphilosophy is, in this sense, just as close to psychology as it is to philosophy. Now, in paraphilosophy, we talk about 4 generalized perspectives, like the subjectivist perspective and the objectivist perspective, and we can also talk about the domains to which those perspectives refer, like the subjective domain and the objective domain. And note here that the subjectivity or objectivity of these domains is merely apparent or relative, not ultimate or absolute. Following this theme, we might then be inclined to refer to paraphilosophy as the parajective domain, or even the parajectivist perspective, insofar as a person may want to mistakenly claim that their philosophy is paraphilosophy. However, parajectivist perspective is an oxymoron, for this would mean the perspective that is beyond perspective. It could of course be more than an oxymoron. It could be a paradox, and we should note that paradox literally means beyond opinion, which is largely equivalent in meaning to parajective, which is largely equivalent to paraphilosophy. But if we want to be rational, we cannot state plainly that there is such a thing as a parajectivist perspective, as this would be a contradiction in terms. Nevertheless, the dialectical matrix reflects the structure of perspective, and if we recognize the interdependent truth of the quadrants of the dialectical matrix, then we could claim this as a kind of universal synthetic perspective, a bit like Hegel's absolute concept. Of course, this is not entirely beyond perspective, it's just beyond any particular perspective. Approached in this way, we might interpret paraphilosophy as polyperspectivism, the belief in multiple perspectives, or as hierarchical pan-perspectivism, the relative belief in all perspectives. So, to follow our previous theme of naming perspectives, we could call the belief that the dialectical matrix describes the structure of phenomenal reality Panjectivism, and we could call the dialectical matrix itself, as the structure of reality, the panjective domain. But again, this is not exactly the same as paraphilosophy itself, because the recognition of the relativity of perspectives is not completely beyond perspective. That which is absolutely beyond perspective we could call the parajective. And again, this term really shouldn't be made into an ism, because the entire point is that it refers to that which is beyond rationalization. So, don't you dare think you have any concept at all of the parajective. You don't. You can of course have concepts of that which is beyond reason. Any philosophy at all which seeks objectivity does this. It's just that those concepts are not parajective. They still exist within the structure of reason. So, if our reality represents the drive towards order and rationality, then its complement would be a state of surrendering to the absence of order and rationality. This drive towards rationality would be related to the construction of the dialectical matrix, and therefore to the panjective as the recognition of the whole structure of rationality. The surrendering to non-rationality, on the other hand, would be related to the abandonment of perspective and to the parajective. So, we have now found that there are two ways that we can approach the question, what is paraphilosophy? First, there is the structure of perspectives which comes into being through the act of philosophy, and ultimately the limited attempt of humans to rationalise reality, and given that no single perspective can exist and be true on its own, there is a more fundamental structure of possible perspectives. This is the first aspect of paraphilosophy, which we have termed the Panjective. And then there is another aspect of paraphilosophy, because the dialectical matrix contains individual perspectives, all of which have meaning only in relation to each other, implying that none of them can be ultimately, absolutely, or independently true. If there is an ultimate truth, it can be none of the perspectives of the dialectical matrix, or rather, the ultimate truth is not a conceptual philosophical position. So, by using the term paraphilosophy, what I hoped to refer to was the inseparable relationship between all perspectives and no perspectives, the panjective and the parajective. At the level of thought, this is a complementary and epistemologically dualistic relation, but ultimately it is an expression of non-duality. The paraphilosophical cannot be rational in the usual sense of the word, because it does not discriminate between any opposites. All formal attempts to explain paraphilosophy will be incomplete, because such explanations can only represent philosophical perspectives that oppose different philosophical perspectives, and this is discrimination. Consider what it would mean for all claims to be complementary and interdependent with their opposites. It would then be a natural conclusion that reason itself, whose structure is expressed by the dialectical matrix, is complementary and interdependent with the non-rational. If the dialectical matrix represents our desire and drive for order and understanding, then non-rationality, the parajective, represents the absence of this drive. But the parajective is not pure irrationality or madness, it is the surrendering to the inability to comprehend reality in a strictly formal sense, which is fundamentally opposed to the spirit of science and philosophy. If all opposites are complementary or interdependent, then no rational content can express a foundation of knowledge. The only foundation of knowledge is the lack of a foundation of knowledge. In other words, the ultimate absence of perspective provides the conditions for the possibility of the relative presence of perspective. There is no essential difference between the lack of an ultimate perspective and the relative truth of perspectives, because different perspectives are possible only because there is no single way a thing must be conceived. Reality is totally unrestricted and open, and it is only the conceptual mind which restricts it. The ultimate truth, if we must name it, is the ungraspable creativity and openness that allows for our relative existence. This creativity is beyond all specifiable limits, for any limit whatsoever would be a determinate precondition on what is possible, and if there were a limit on what is possible, then, for one, true creativity and freedom would not be possible, but secondly, there would then be an absolutely true perspective which affirms and explains this limit. If we recognise that there is no absolutely true perspective, then we can also begin to recognise that there cannot be any limit to the creativity and openness of which our world is an expression. The ultimate truth is the non-duality between the absence of an ultimate truth and the presence of relative truths, which is the self-similarity of complementarity. Relative truth is the complementary content, ultimate truth is the self-similar structure of that content. That is, the complementary relation between paraphilosophy and philosophy, the ability for belief and belief itself, is the ultimate truth. It is a unity between contingency and necessity. It is spontaneity, inevitability, freedom, a kind of necessity that is possible only because there is no necessity. The consequence of there being no ultimate way things are is that things are able to appear as they do, and this is ultimately the way things are. It's absolute relativity, and the problem of what is ultimately true has vanished before our eyes. Things exist because they can, and because they should. That's it, and it's beautiful. Okay, now we're ready to take things a lot deeper. As a brief refresher, this is the dialectical matrix, and it represents all of the ways in which we can conceive of the nature of reality, of knowledge, of value, and all other philosophical notions. One of the quadrants refers to self-consciousness and to concrete universality, which is to say, a kind of universal substance. This quadrant refers both to a unity of opposites and to the phenomenon of self-reference, since it is a confluence of subjectivity and objectivity, where the subject has become its own object. As the dialectical matrix represents a unified structure, the self-reference of this quadrant, which we call the superjective perspective, is the self-reference of the matrix as a whole. It is that aspect of reality which recognizes itself as real. In the previous sections, we laid the foundations for understanding that the dialectical matrix represents the structure and process through which self-consciousness rationalizes and realizes itself as the concrete universal. But this superjective self-consciousness is not an independent ultimate reality. It is really a quality of the self-referential nature of the matrix. The superjective is therefore totally dependent on what it is conscious of. It is that aspect of life which allows us to become aware of things via subject-object duality, and therefore it always occurs in the presence of the representations within it. And as this is a self-referential system, it is continuously self-modifying, so that as we learn more about ourselves, we become something different, something with more knowledge, and more self-justification, and more reality. And all we are trying to understand is our own capacity for understanding, and this capacity is one way to interpret the term paraphilosophy. We could also say, drawing a parallel to Hegel, that the perfection of the capacity to understand is the absolute idea, or the perfect concept of conceptualization itself, which is the ultimate truth, being simultaneously the source of our capacity for understanding, the goal of our drive for understanding, and the very fuel of that drive. The ultimate truth is that condition which permits the emergence of the egoic drive for self-mastery. It is absolute freedom and selflessness, because only that which is not attached to itself, but more importantly, is not attached to being unattached, is free to become attached or remain unattached to itself. So, the fact that we are trying to understand is really the opposite of what we fundamentally are, because there is only an ability to understand insofar as there is no need to understand. There is only limitation insofar as there is freedom. Our effort to understand what we are is the opposite of what we are, yet it is also our effort to understand which generates the complexity of the phenomenal world. That is, the phenomenal world is a product of our lack of perfect self-understanding, a product of ignorance. What we really are is the openness and freedom to try and understand what we are, but this openness and freedom has no compulsion in itself to try to understand. It is merely the potential for such a compulsion to play itself out. And if there were no trying to understand, there would be no representation of this trying, and no phenomenal world. But since we can only try insofar as we are able to try, the phenomenal world is certainly an expression of freedom. It is simply that from the perspective of freedom, It is a playful expression, while from the perspective of compulsion, it is a delusion. Same thing, different emphases. Freedom, being unlimited, permits the possibility of self-reference, and self-reference leads to limitation. The basic goal of life is to overcome itself, which is liberation from the illusion of ignorance and separation. Again, there is no real separation between freedom and phenomenality, because freedom is the possibility of having a perspective. This does not mean that the ultimate understanding is indistinguishable from delusion, because delusion is the idea that an interpretation can be absolutely true, and the only thing that is absolutely true is that no interpretation is absolutely true. This absence of an ultimate essence is freedom, which, paradoxically, is itself a kind of ultimate essence of a higher non-conceptual order. Now, consider that the dialectical matrix is constructed via a principle of complementarity. Each perspective arises only in dependence with an opposite perspective which completes it. The abjective depends on the superjective and vice versa. The subjective depends on the objective and vice versa. And these two dialectics depend on each other as well. If we negate the dialectical matrix, rejecting all four perspectives, then we're left with that which is not any of the four perspectives, which we previously labelled the parajective, and which could perhaps be thought of as the unrealised potential for self-understanding. The parajective, no perspectives, is then the complement to the panjective, which is the acceptance of all perspectives, and which represents the structure of the actual drive to understand, which is the dialectical matrix. Both of these considered together, the universal rejection and the universal acceptance, is what we mean by the term paraphilosophy. Now, the four quadrants represent the different ways that we are able to explain our own existence, and the superjective represents the actual self-reflective process we experience as self-consciousness. Superjectivism can thus be thought of in two ways. On one hand, it is a particular perspective of the dialectical matrix, and to believe in this exclusively would be to say that consciousness is the only reality and everything else is an illusion. But on the other hand, the superjective, being the self-referential concrete universal, is nothing other than the dialectical matrix itself. It is constituted by its contents. The superjective, like consciousness, is therefore transparent. It cannot be found, for all we can see when we look at consciousness is what consciousness is conscious of, which is just the contents of the dialectical matrix. Consciousness is never directly and completely conscious of itself, for all intentionality implies that there is a subject opposing an object. If we take this view then, that all quadrants are different aspects or representations of consciousness, then the different perspectives are not mere illusions, but are rather the real constituents of conscious experience. It is merely the notion that a certain perspective could possibly be true on its own, which is an illusion. Now, I want to bring our attention to something interesting that is going on here in paraphilosophy. Keep in mind that every characterization of reality is complementary with its opposite. But since superjectivism can be characterized in two different ways, as an individual perspective and as the unity of all perspectives, each of these characterizations must have its own complement. If we take superjectivism as a particular exclusive perspective, then exclusive superjectivism is the complementary perspective to exclusive abjectivism. Exclusive superjectivism says that there is only the concrete universal, there is a universal consciousness, but no properties, while exclusive abjectivism says that there are only abstract particulars, there are properties, but no universal consciousness. And if only the properties of apparent experiences are real, the exclusive abjectivist may interpret abstract particularity as a mathematical or informational reality that merely appears as sensible qualities from our limited, ignorant point of view. They may argue that noumenal reality exists outside of experience, and they may claim that the ultimate reality is some kind of field of possibility, and that possibility is more fundamental than actuality. On the other hand, if we take Superjectivism as the self-referential dialectical matrix itself, including all other perspectives, then it is the complement to what we previously termed the Parajective. Superjectivism as Panjectivism is the affirmation of all perspectives, while the Parajective is the negation of all perspectives. At one level, we are distinguishing conscious experience, the superjective, from that which is hypothetically outside of conscious experience, the abjective. In other words, we're distinguishing a kind of non-dual subjectivity, where form has dissolved into pure consciousness, from a kind of non-dual objectivity, where consciousness has dissolved into pure form. But at the other level, we are distinguishing between rationality as a whole, the panjective, from that which is beyond the rational, the parajective. So we have the conscious versus the unconscious, and we have the rational versus the unrational. Now, given that the superjective is self-referential, such that it is both whole and part, we can understand that there must be a connection between the particular superjective and the universal panjective, that is, between conscious experience and rationality. Indeed, this is what we have already shown in Paraphilosophy, that experience is reason. If we understand this, then it also makes sense that there should be a connection between the two complements of the superjective, between the abjective and the parajective, which is to say, between that which is hypothetically beyond conscious experience and that which is beyond rationality. However, the dialectical matrix is precisely the structure of reason, and so the abjective is necessarily an aspect of reason insofar as it is part of the matrix. It cannot be the case that the abjective is related to the parajective in the way that the superjective is related to the panjective. Now, before we move on, let us quickly be reminded of Immanuel Kant's transcendental idealism, which is the recognition that our experience of reality is structured by certain categories of understanding, and that we cannot access things as they are in themselves. Kant is therefore not a transcendental abjectivist of the sort I just described, because he does not provide an intelligible theory of the noumenon. He is an abjectivist in the sense that he holds phenomena to be abjective, that is, structured by synthetic a priori principles and constituted by abstract particular representations. Kant's form of abjectivism is therefore quite compatible with the paraphilosophical or syntheoretic view. But an exclusive transcendental abjectivist or realist who claims that reality is ultimately some kind of mathematical or informational or otherwise abstract structure existing independently of conscious experience, something like simulation theory, for instance, has certainly not gone beyond philosophy or beyond reason. They are, rather, reasoning beyond experience. Nevertheless, the abjective surely does seem to possess a unique position in paraphilosophy due to its proximity to the parajective, as mentioned earlier. Now, speaking from the conventional empirical level of analysis, if the objective is a conditioned representation of a physics of experience, and if the subjective is a conditioned representation of a psychology of experience, then the abjective is a conditioned representation of a foundation of experience. There is not ultimately any intrinsic physics to reality, and there is not ultimately any intrinsic psychology to reality, and there is not ultimately any intrinsic foundation to reality. But these things are still necessary for our ability to rationalize reality, and so they manifest as parts of our ability to understand experience. From the conventional empirical level of analysis, therefore, I think it will become quite natural for us to isolate the abjective as the foundation of reality. It's just that this collapses at the ultimate level, because at the ultimate level, There is no distinction between any of the quadrants. There is no rationalization at all, just a spontaneous presence, which is perfectly correlated with our ability to explain that presence in a rational way. But correlation is not causation. So, the transcendental abjective, as some kind of informational structure, is what the ultimate foundation would be like if an ultimate foundation were necessary. It is the closest approximation to an ultimate ground that exists within the realm of reason, precisely because it is a rationalization of the unrationalizable. It is the representative of the ineffable. Remember, phenomenal reality is a construct of reason, which is defined by the dialectical matrix. And so the transcendental abjective is the rational reflection of that which cannot be rationalized. It is the conceptualization of the non-conceptual, and it is the projection of intelligibility onto that which remains beyond the dialectical matrix and beyond any perspective, the parajective. And this in itself is very important. Abjectivism is that area of paraphilosophy which reveals the deepest aspects of reason. It will reveal the structure of possible experience. It will reveal the operation of subjectivity in generating experience. It will unify quantum physics and depth psychology within some kind of mathematical theory of everything. But we must be careful not to mistake the harmonic generation of a relative, dependent foundation with the discovery of an ultimate, independent foundation, for that would be to confuse correlation with causation, and to undermine the harmony of all the quadrants. If extreme superjectivism points to the panjective, then extreme abjectivism points to the parajective. Both are fingers pointing at the moon, and two different sides of the moon at that. The one interprets paraphilosophy as the relative truth of all perspectives, the other interprets it as the ultimate untruth of all perspectives. In the next part of this series, because we're nowhere near done, we're going to explore the relations between Buddhism, Vedanta, and paraphilosophy in some depth, to ascertain whether these two approaches, Abjectivism and Superjectivism, can provide two angles through which we can approach the same ultimate truth. Consider that the standard, inclusive form of Abjectivism sees reality as an interdependent network of particular qualities of experience, while Superjectivism sees reality as one integrated, self-knowing whole. This distinction mirrors a characterization of reality found in Buddhism and Vedanta respectively. Furthermore, the ultimate truth in Buddhism is a feature of appearances themselves. It is the relativity of appearances, surmised by the claim that form is emptiness, emptiness is form. This is a bit like saying that the abjective is the appearance of the parajective, and the parajective is the nature of the abjective. Conversely, the ultimate truth in Vedanta is the source of awareness. It is the absoluteness of awareness, surmised by the claim that Atman is Brahman and Brahman is Atman. This is a bit like saying that the superjective is the appearance of the panjective, and the panjective is the nature of the superjective. And there's also another way to explain the relation between the parajective and the abjective through Buddhism, because the designated truth value of the abjectivist quadrant is neither true nor false. And even though Nagarjuna seeks to transcend the four alternative status predicates of the Chatuscoty altogether to reach the viewless view of emptiness, the status predicate, neither true nor false, still does seem to have a privileged position in Buddhism, even if that privilege is for practical purposes of communication only. The reason for this is that this neither view rejects affirmation, i.e. there is a self, and it rejects rejection, i.e. there is no self, which prevents us from taking a dualistic stance on a philosophical matter concerning ultimate reality. Saying neither is valid is not an assertion about what is valid, but an assertion about what is not valid, and so this position might be thought of as the last step in the process of breaking down conceptual thinking before we are able to transcend it completely. The polarity between the abjective and the superjective is essentially the middle way between extremes, but the middle way must itself be transcended in order to clear the path to direct realization. It is the raft that can carry us to the other shore, providing we remember to sink the raft once we have passed. So while it can be very useful in deconstructing dualistic notions, we must at some point be careful not to rest in mistaking the perspective of that which is beyond perspective with that which is actually beyond perspective, because while we can talk about the former, we can say nothing of the latter. That which is beyond perspectives and theories cannot be a perspective or a theory, and any attempt to provide a theory that intends to reflect the absolute truth will be precisely the kind of speculative metaphysics that paraphilosophy, so as Kant, seeks to move beyond. The tendency to want to rationalize the unrationalizable underscores the inherent paradox of trying to transcend one's own egoic limitations by means of those same limitations. The attempt to escape the self through our own intellectual effort reinforces the very duality that the transcendental realist seeks to overcome, which is the duality between the absolute and the relative. I'm reminded here of a quote by Kierkegaard, who said, "The ultimate paradox of thought is to want to discover something that thought itself cannot think." Of course, for Kierkegaard, that paradox is itself God, but it can be described only as the absolutely different. Hence, many religions employ the apophatic method of via negativa, and what is this but a clear attempt to point towards the parajective? For Kierkegaard, the paradox is where knowledge ends and faith must begin. Humans are so fundamentally locked into their categories of thought that it is impossible for us to intellectually grasp something that is absolutely different from absolutely everything that is intellectual and can be grasped.
And that's it for this instalment. In the next video, we'll be exploring the connections between paraphilosophy, Buddhism, and Vedanta. Again, if you found this video valuable and would like to support me, you can find out how to do so in the description below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.